They say that the real Scotland is not to be found in a single moment. It will dawn on you more than once as you explore this wonderful country. Gradually, you will realize that this apparent land of magic, which could be anywhere, could be nowhere else. Whatever the season, spring, summer, or autumn, the colors tell you where you are. There's nowhere else where the light can change as it does here in Scotland. The gateway to Scotland is Prestwick Airport, where travellers from all over the world know that they will find a welcome among a people to whom hospitality is a way of life. What's needed here, as someone once said, is a well-developed sense of wonder. Romance is not the word. It lacks the depth of feeling which Scotland engenders among those who are alert to her charms. On your first visit, beware. It will not be the last. Scotland has a way of drawing people back to know her better. Even the airport is not like just any airport. It's full of the air of God's own country, Scotland the brave. The first thing to accept on visiting Scotland is history and its profound influence on the landscape and the people. Along the borders, you'll find castles whose ruins could tell you stories which could make your hair stand on end. Hermitage Castle dates from the 13th century, a great stronghold of the Douglas family, who ruled this stretch of the borders with an iron hand. The windows may be blind today, but they have seen more history than most. The first village you come to when you leave England on the old road is Gretna, at the head of the Solway Firth. It takes its fame from the old blacksmith's shop at Gretna Green, where for 200 years it was legal to marry at the Scottish age of consent, 16, without waiting until the English age, which used to be 21. It's all changed now, but if you ask, the blacksmith will still perform a ceremony over you. And who's to say what special meaning it might have? The border region is haunted by stories of the past. To today's visitor, it may be the place to catch salmon, or to buy tweed or cashmere, or to search for ancestors. But you may be sure that those ancestors knew this area when it was very much the border, changing hands every few years between England and Scotland. The River Tweed, where it runs through Peebles, was then the front line. The chief trade of Peebles since the end of the 18th century has been wool. Traquair House is a fine example of a medieval Scottish house, visited, they say, by 27 kings and queens. The Laird of Traquair still brews his own beer. Melrose Abbey has fine perpendicular windows, and nearby Jedburgh Abbey dates from the 12th century. Both were founded by French monks. Together, they suffered the fate of all abbeys under Henry VIII, but they left behind them a link which nothing could undo with France and the Catholic faith. Jedburgh has its own jail and a house which tells the story of the links with France in all its grandeur and sadness. This was where, they say, Mary Queen of Scots lived for part of her heroic and doomed existence. Kelso, too, has a sad and heroic history. Its abbey was the site of one of the last great stands against the English in 1545. It was a prosperous town then. When the battle was lost, the abbey was reduced to its present condition. But what is left of it still stands as a memorial to a people who were prepared to die for their country and their religion. The last of the monks leapt from these turrets onto the pikes and spears of the victorious English. Just a few miles away, Eyemouth is one of the celebrated smuggling harbours of the border country. They used to say in the old days that more people lived under the rocks at Eyemouth than lived on top of them. The smugglers kept themselves to themselves. The fishing went on until the dreadful day in 1881 when the fleet was wrecked and half the women of Eyemouth were widowed in one night. Now, a museum stands as a memorial to that night, and the fishing goes on. The borders have always been a lively place. When the Douglases held sway in these parts, they needed secure fortresses to keep out their enemies. Tantallon Castle was one which they built in the 14th century. Looming behind it, out to sea, is the Bass Rock, the site of one of the biggest gannet colonies in Europe. St. Abb's Head, not far away, is another famous colony full of rare breeding birds. It's a site of special scientific interest. But the whole of this Lothian coast is a site of interest. Inland, in elegant Haddington, there's a trail which guides you through centuries of the town's distinguished history. The church tower is known as the Lamp of Lothian. It shines out across the birthplaces of John Knox and Samuel Smiles. The Firth of Forth was carved out by glaciers long before mankind ever appeared in these parts. The Queen of the Firth of Forth is the city of Edinburgh. It dates back to the 12th century, when the little village grew round the foot of the rock where the castle stands. To the Celts, it was Dunedin, the castle on the hill. The Anglo-Saxons didn't change the name, they just translated it into their own language and called it Edinburgh. The new town was built at the end of the 18th century, when Princess Street Gardens were laid out, together with Princess Street itself, today one of the most famous streets in Europe. Waverley Market is newer than that, but it serves a very old purpose, not just as a trading place, but as a meeting place for people from all over the world. The contrasting sides of Edinburgh are always in view, the modern and the historic spectacle, which has been unchanged for centuries. Whether you want to explore the 1,000 years of history which is enshrined in the Royal Mile, or dig back into your own past, is entirely up to you. The attraction of Scotland to people from all over the world is the fact that they might have had ancestors here in the distant or not so distant past. Cynics might say the bagpipes sound like somebody trying to strangle a cat. Some Scotsmen don't care much for them either, but the thought that you might be entitled to your own tartan, actually to be a member of this ancient country, is another thing again. Pride in the past is the hallmark of the Scot. Lady Stair's house, the writer's shrine, and St. Giles Cathedral, the high kirk of the city, are two sides of the same reverence for the great days of old. Holyrood House is the official residence of the Queen when she visits Scotland. The palace is redolent of the grandeur of high Stuart days at the end of the 17th century. Linlithgow Palace was even grander, at one time the favourite home of the Stuart kings. But the interior was burnt out in a fire in 1745, and it's never been the same since. The exterior is still decorated in fine Renaissance style. Beside the palace lies Linlithgow Loch, a little piece of the country, but close to one of Scotland's major industrial areas, specialising in oil and chemicals. Engineering, 2 generations of it, is much in evidence where the old rail and new road bridges cross the Forth. The Palace of Scone is a relatively recent addition to the scene, but it stands on foundations 1,000 years old. It contains rare porcelain and ivory, wonderful furniture, and some of the finest bed hangings in Scotland. It is said they were embroidered by Mary Queen of Scots herself. Perth, on Tayside, is often called the Fair City. It's a handsome, prosperous place with a maritime past. Even now, the River Tay is navigable right up to the town, but the river's not entirely to be trusted. It has washed away 2 bridges and a castle in only the last 750 years. This part of the coast is known as the East Neuk of Fife. Crail is the oldest of the 4 boroughs of the ancient Kingdom of Fife. Once it was the biggest fish market in Europe, but that was a long time ago. Now it's a sleepy little place, but fishing is still important. Another little fishing harbour 10 miles away is famous for something else again. It was once referred to by a poet as a little city worn and grey. He also remarked that it is by the Northern Sea. Here's a clue. St Andrews, home of the royal and ancient. Need one say more? For interest, the record for the old course is 47, set in 1867 by Tommy Morris, who was 17 at the time. The game dates to the 15th century, but its popularity outside Scotland is much newer. Glen Eagles is one of a generation of hotels which was built particularly for golfers. It has 4 courses of its own. Under the protective eye of Stirling Castle, the Dunblane Hydro is an old health resort, which has found new life as a luxury hotel. It stands among the glories of Tayside, where the river is quieter than it was in Perth. The hills and glens of Tayside attract travellers in search of tranquil scenery and the deep peace of a rich countryside. The Queen's View near Pitlochry is just that. Whenever Queen Victoria came past here, she would stop her carriage just to gaze down on the beauties of Loch Tummel. Blair Athol, nearby, was the last British castle to be held under siege by its owner, Lord George Murray, when he came home from the Jacobite campaign in 1746 to find the place full of squatters. But if you're looking for history, it needn't be of a grand sort. You could research your own personal history by finding out whether you're a member of a clan and entitled to wear its tartan. There are about 140 clans, some dating back hundreds of years, and some Victorian. The old Queen was a great one for instant history. Anyone can search among the tartans on show to find out whether they are personally qualified to wear one. Families who do not have a Scottish name may still be allied to one clan or another. The clans were spread overseas by soldiers and engineers, doctors and missionaries, among the millions of Scottish expatriates who went to build the empire. Some famous children of Scotland, that's what the word clan means, found fame in far-off lands under old Scottish names. Others died generations ago to bring their clan honour in a foreign field. Every inch of Scotland is steeped in its history. The ruins of Ruthven Barracks speak of military glories. And not far away, there's evidence of the animal glories of the old country. Reindeer died out long ago in these parts, but their relatives, brought back from Scandinavia, live comfortably in what was their home before the Ice Ages changed everything. This is the Highland Wildlife Park, not far from Kincraig. Nearby are the Cairngorm Mountains, one of the centres of Scotland's growing skiing industry. Aviemore may not be the Alps or Tyrol, but it offers year-round sport in Strathspey, the valley of the River Spey. The scenery and the air of energy which surrounds Aviemore and nearby Coylham Bridge attracts travellers, and the travellers attract the sellers of things that travellers like to buy. Not all of them are what are usually recognised as Scottish crafts, but there are some which cannot be found elsewhere, like real Scottish heather or genuine shortbread. Water sports are international. There's nothing special about Scottish water until they use it to make whisky, but the scenery sets Loch Morlich apart. In a setting like this, falling off only gives you more time to enjoy the view. In the Grampian Mountains, north of the Highland line, but often lowland in appearance, the views are something to treasure. Where the mountains rise above the lowland plateau, they do it properly. The peaks of the Grampians at 4,000 feet are topped only by Ben Nevis itself. The people round here are sturdy, self-sufficient farmers and cattle breeders, and the area is the home of the Aberdeen Angus. It was also where the Romans defeated the Picts over 1,000 years ago. Ballater came back into the mainstream of Scottish history only 150 years ago, when Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert began to buy land round the small ancient castle of Balmoral. Suddenly, the little village became almost part of the royal family. The royal appointment signs, and others no doubt intended for the royal corgis, suggest the wealth of a settled agricultural community. When the Queen found Balmoral, she called it a pretty little castle in old Scottish style. She proceeded to demolish it and rebuild it in the new Victorian Romantic style. Not far away, real castles remember times which were not so settled, when a good thick wall was the best guarantee of peace with prickly neighbours. At Craigievar Castle, they managed to top those walls with gables and turrets to give today's fairy tale appearance. There are even older conflicts remembered here. Lumfannin Peelring is an ancient earthwork from which the inhabitants fought many a desperate last-ditch stand. Nearby, ancient beliefs still make their mark on the landscape. Tomnavery is a Bronze Age stone circle whose function is forgotten, but whose magic lives on. Culsh Earth House, near Aboyne, is Pictish in origin, a memory of an all but forgotten race who were here before the Romans or the Celts who displaced them. Stonehaven is a quiet little fishing town with winding, narrow lanes leading down to the shore. It's a popular summer resort for people who like to avoid the big cities. But for those who like big cities, there's Aberdeen, not a stone's throw away. It grew up where the Dee and Don rivers meet the sea, and it's always been an important fishing harbour on a grand scale. It's known as Granite City. Its grander buildings sparkle in the sunlight and were put up in the Georgian property boom, as elegant as Edinburgh, but far sterner in aspect. Aberdonians have a reputation for being tight-fisted and somewhat prickly in their dealings with outsiders. This is completely untrue. They're as welcoming and open-handed as anyone else in Scotland. They just foster the joke a little at their own expense, and it must be said, to their own benefit. It's a dignified city with a long tradition of culture and learning and growing roses. The botanical gardens are as fine as any in the country in this northern outpost of the cactus. This part of Scotland gave the world something far more memorable than an appreciation of botany in its more exotic forms. The road from Aberdeen leads to the heart and home of the whisky country. 20,000 people are employed in the making, blending, bottling, and selling of Scotland's greatest gift to the human race. The skills that go to making the water of life are 1,000 years old. It's hard to believe that it was only 200 years ago that the drink was first known outside Scotland. Some Scottish doctors who practiced in London began prescribing whisky as a medicine to their grateful patients. Its fame soon spread to cover the world. Now, pilgrims can inspect the old pot stills and sample the product for themselves, right where it first saw the light of day. "250 years ago, in April 1746, Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobites faced the superior forces of the Duke of Cumberland here on Culloden Moor. 1,000 of them were killed and the rest scattered. The prince died in miserable exile. As someone said at the time, never was there dawn so brilliant, never sunset so clouded, as in the young prince's life. But he and his men will never be forgotten. Where the River Ness joins the Caledonian Canal in the waters of the Inverness Firth stands Inverness, a very peaceful town now, but one which was no stranger to English occupation. They say the people here speak the purest form of English there is. Down there on the promontory stands Urquhart Castle, guardian over the most famous stretch of water in Scotland, Loch Ness. Nearby, at Drumnadrochit, is the Loch Ness Monster Exhibition Centre. It contains some good evidence that there is something out there in the dark water, but it's your guess what it might be. Thousands of people have spent thousands of hours staring out across the loch, and still, no one knows for sure whether the monster is a living fossil or pipe dream. Some of the finest scenery in Scotland is here, among the hills of Easter Ross, beside the Cromarty Firth. Around the villages of Edderton, Helmsdale and Berrydale, tucked in where the glens meet the sea, hangs the magic of the Highland coastline. They're fishing villages, only recently connected to the rest of the world by road. The memory of the lost race is retained in mounds like the grey cairns of Camster, built over 1,000 years ago by the Picts, and still seen by thousands of visitors to Caithness each year. The town of Wick was once the market centre for all the fishing villages. It's no longer the headquarters of the herring trade, but it serves as a market town for the farmers of this part of Caithness. A castle of the Sinclairs stands at the head of Sinclair's Bay, near Wick. Only the name survives of what was once a mighty fortress. Scotland comes to an end at Jonah Groats, the end of the northbound road. It got its name from Jan de Groot, a Dutch settler who was the first person to live up here. Away from the Razamataz, there are magnificent sea views from Dunnet Head, which looks out across the Pentland Firth. From the end of the country, we turn to the west, towards the sunset and the Western Highlands. The train takes us to Glenfinnan, where at the head of Loch Shiel there stands a monument to Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that he stood for. Loch Shiel itself epitomizes the beauty of the Highlands, scenery which cannot be matched anywhere in the world. The country round about inspired Dr. Johnson to make a momentous decision. In 1773, while he was travelling along this road, he made up his mind to write the book which has brought more visitors to Scotland than any other, his Journey to the Western Isles. This is the true road to the Isles, wandering westward through a world-famous landscape. Loch Duich must have appeared on more biscuit tins than any other body of water on earth. Ilendonnan Castle guards the entrance to the loch. It was bombarded by the Royal Navy in 1719 to thwart an attempted Spanish landing in aid of the Jacobites. The nearby village of Dorney has never known a day like it before or since. From the Kyle of Lochalsh, not far from here, the ferry takes just 5 minutes to go over the sea to Skye. Long before Flora MacDonald carried her prince in her bonny boat, another adventurous lady known as Saucy Mary lived here in Moyle Castle. The ruins still stand, but the chain which she stretched across to the mainland has gone. She used to demand tolls from every passing boat. Skye has a quiet of its own, which is not lost on its many visitors. The land is fertile and the climate kind, and though the old crofters might not have had it easy, they had it gentle. Some of the houses are preserved for visitors to admire, and perhaps to provide the material for dreams of getting away from it all. The language, in the Bible as well as on the lips of the people, is Gaelic. Like the other Celtic languages, it lives on in the westernmost corners of the British Isles. The chieftain of the Clan MacLeod lives in Dunvegan Castle, home of the fairy flag, sacred to all MacLeods. The wealth of this whole island comes from its natural resources and its visitors. Dr. Johnson recognized the prosperity and security of the people in 1773 when he wrote the first tourist guide. Visitors come from all over the world. Scottish ancestry or no Scottish ancestry, while they're here, everyone wishes they were a MacLeod or a MacDonald. Near to Skye is Staffa, the island of staves. It's formed from tall basalt pillars, the result of some long, distant volcanic upheaval. Fingal's Cave on this island gave Mendelssohn the idea for his overture, The Hebrides. Iona has been a source of inspiration for longer than that. The abbey was built in the 15th century, but the island has been a holy place since St. Columba landed here in the year 563 AD. There are 48 Scottish kings buried on the island, from the Dark Ages onward. Oban is the most lively of the West Highland resorts, especially popular with yachtsmen. On the hill above the harbour is McCaig's Tower, built by a local benefactor trying to provide work for unemployed fishermen. Sadly, he went bankrupt. Highland cattle gaze peacefully over the waters of the loch. We're in Strathclyde now, the country of the Campbells, whose clan chief is the Duke of Argyll. At Inverary, the castle contains relics collected by the Duke's ancestors from a Spanish galleon which was wrecked nearby. The Auchendrane Museum contains more Spanish remains, together with elements of history of the Campbells and of the way of life of the farmers in the area. The past is always part of the present in Scotland, the scenery and the families who made it and loved it down the centuries. For visitors, whether they walk or ride ponies, fish or just stare at the beauty of the Trossachs, the love that this landscape has inspired is easy to understand. These are the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond, filled with history and legends, and nowadays with people playing on the water. Each island has its own legend, or even a true story to tell, from the days of Robert the Bruce or the MacGregor chieftains. The Kyles of Bute form the moat to the Isle of Bute. For sailors, it presents a special challenge, since it's so narrow that in some places you feel that you could touch both sides at once. Rothesay has long been one of the favourite seaside resorts of the citizens of nearby Glasgow. It was one of the favourite holiday places of the Stuart kings, one of whom built the castle here 600 years ago. At Dunoon, higher up the Firth of Clyde, every August sees the Cowell Highland Gathering, where over 150 pipe bands compete for trophies, and strong men gather to show their prowess with the hammer and the caber. The idea is not to throw the caber as far as possible, but rather to flip it over and persuade it to land in as straight a line as possible. And it's not very easy. The Queen of the Clyde the biggest city in Scotland is Glasgow. Its name is supposed to mean dear green place, and since the city fathers saw fit to make it a smokeless zone and to declare from the city chambers that the building should be cleaned, it's once more the object of civic pride. The grandeur of the city chambers inside express the confidence of the shipbuilders and tobacco barons who built the city. Glasgow has nearly 750,000 inhabitants, which makes it the third largest city in the British Isles, after London and Birmingham. It has been through dark times, but a sense of renewal is in the air these days, and the buildings have been returned to their 18th century glory. The cathedral has gazed down over good times and bad times since the 12th century, when it was first built and dedicated to Glasgow's patron, St. Mungo. A wit once remarked that all Glasgow needs is a bath and a little loving care. She's having her bath, and with the cleanliness, the loving care is returning to the dear green place. One of Glasgow's wealthiest sons was the man who gave the Buddle collection to his native city in 1945. It is housed now in the specially designed art gallery in Pollock Park. The Buddle collection is a wonderland of medieval tapestries, stained glass and antique furniture, ceramics and European pictures. Further down the west coast is a town made famous by one man, Robert Burns, who wrote of his town, "All there, wham ne'er a tune surpasses for honest men and bonny lasses." His poems will live for as long as there's a Scotsman alive. There are museums and memorials to him all over this region, particularly in his birthplace, Alloway. Here, the great day is recorded. The cottage is as he would have remembered it, as if he had just stepped outside for a moment. The old brig achieved immortality in Burns's poem Tam O'Shanter. This monument stands right beside it. And his family are buried in the kirkyard nearby. Culzean Castle was rebuilt by the celebrated architect Robert Adam for the Kennedy family, who needed a new home because they had to leave America, where they'd lived until then, during some troubles in 1776. It must have been a shame to leave their old address, number 1 Broadway, but the new one had a lot to offer, especially in the way of scenery. This view was presented to General Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1947 as a mark of Scotland's gratitude to a great war leader. His family still makes use of the penthouse suite in Culzean Castle. Further south, in Dumfries and Galloway, lies Port Logan, where a small tidal basin in the harbour attracts cod, which are tame enough to feed out of people's hands. It's 200 years old, but much more recent, barely a century old, is Logan Botanic Gardens. The palms and other subtropical plants here were planted during the period when it was fashionable to demonstrate the fertility of the ground and the mildness of the climate by proving what exotic plants could be made to grow in it. In other gardens, the emphasis is on the natural. But Logan House offers an insight into the philosophy of Victorian gardeners and attracts an endless stream of visitors. At Kirkcudbright, where the River Dee meets the sea, the mild winds blow over a town with all the grace of the 18th century. Its hospitable harbour was the foundation of a much older settlement. There are houses dating back over 400 years. The castle, though, whose ruins overlook the town, is a mere youngster from the 17th century. The last witch was tried in Kirkcudbright in 1805, in front of the toll booth. But they were enlightened times, and she only got a year's hard labour. In Dumfries itself, only 24 miles from Gretna, where our journey began, the memory of Robert Burns is still bright. He lived here during the last few years of his life, writing his final songs and poems between his working days as a customs officer in the port. The Burns Museum is in the house where he died. Burns is often taken as the voice of Scotland, but she has many voices. Loch Duich is the public face of the country, but she has many faces. The only way to appreciate her contrasts is to pay her a visit.